So first, I'd like to thank you all for coming out this evening. Just a little bit of background on the event tonight and how it ties into a larger program at Columbia Business School. This is part of our Research Meets Practice speaker series, where we bring in eminent thinkers from within the university, from schools around the country, as well as outside the academy, to talk about ideas that sit at the intersection of research and practical policy and business practice. Some of the past speakers that we've had have included Mike Spence, a Nobel laureate in economics, speaking about economic development. As I was telling the speakers about earlier, a discussion by an Ayn Rand historian, Justin Fox, talking about economic history or the financial crisis, depending on who you ask. And this evening, we're extremely happy to have Roger Lowenstein and Noam Scheiber to talk again about, in some sense, depending on how you look at it, economic history or the economic crisis. I will say I left my introduction notes over there. So I will actually be very brief, and you can take more than just my word for it that this is an improvised introduction. Why I wanted to say about this book, the two of them actually need very little by way of introduction. They're both eminent financial journalists and chroniclers of the financial and economic scene in this country. The book that they're going to focus on, when it first came out, most of the reviews were prefaced with or ended by saying, well, this book just doesn't seem that relevant anymore since we're now out of the financial crisis. So what are you talking about? The Obama administration didn't get things quite right. But everything that's old is new again, and the latest financial numbers suggest that we may not yet have escaped the recession that beset this country now a few years ago. I also think that this book isn't first and foremost about the financial crisis. It's about how economic policy is made in Washington, which, despite recent efforts towards transparency, remains, to many of us, a pretty mysterious and murky black box. The one other thing that I had in my notes, and I certainly won't get the quote right, I got an email from my brother just as the book was coming out. He had no idea that we were running an event with Mr. Scheiber here at Columbia, saying that any book with an item like this in the index has to be worth reading. He sent me a link to a mini review from Mr. Scheiber's colleagues at the New Republic, listing what he thought was the best index item he'd ever seen, which was a reference to Summers, Larry, hygiene practices of, or something like that. So I will now turn it over to Roger Lowenstein and Noam Scheiber to talk about policy making in the Obama administration, and maybe they'll throw in a little bit on the grooming habits of Larry Summers as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that improvised introduction. I just want to throw in a review of my own, which is, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I think Noam has done a very entertaining and thoughtful and prescient first cut at history. I don't, there are going to be a lot of books about the Obama years to come, but I think he's already set the frame for many writers who are going to follow in the years ahead. And I think the frame, as I see it, is that these guys had an opportunity to do something very radical and dramatic, to be more than sort of the Bill Clinton kind of Democrats who were just, the age of big government is over, and we're just going to worry about the bond market, and we're going to kind of look like Republicans. That these guys had the opportunity to be Democrats who looked like they were Democrats, and instead, to quote some line of yours, I think towards the end, they deferred to the person of the Darth, Tim Geithner, Vader, and became more like, not like Republicans certainly, but like Bill Clinton Democrats. Is that is that your first cut of your own book, or?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think if you looked at the the Obama economic team, sort of circa spring of 2008, you would have found a very eclectic, not entirely coherent mix of thinkers and former policy hands. And I think there was a real energy there, a lot of ideas that had been floating around the academy for years, but were very new and sort of cutting edge in the economic policy sphere, behavioral economics being one of them, behavioral finance, were very much in vogue among this group of people. Certainly not the only way in which they were innovative, but they were eclectic and they were quirky. And then by sort of July of, a few months, if you fast forward a few months later, suddenly you're talking about the kind of standard, sort of Rubenesque Democratic lineup. And I think what's interesting about that is, if you look at Obama again back in the spring, you think it fits. Okay, he's got these quirky people.
Spring of '09.
I'm sorry, spring of '08, when he's running as a candidate. Yeah, it makes sense because he appears to be this anti-establishment figure. He's very much the insurgent in the Democratic primaries. And, he's sort of taking on this Death Star that is Hillary Clinton at the time, who has all this establishment support.
Or he's post-establishment.
Or he's post, whatever he is, right? He's right. He's transcended establishmentarianism. But what turns out, and this is something that I sort of kept running into over and over again, as I kind of looked into Obama's own biography, is he's very much an establishmentarian kind of guy. And this sort of runs through really his entire career. I mean, it sort of starts with, presumably starts at a younger age than this, but I mean, he was the Harvard Law Review president. When he is first running for Senate, U.S. Senate in Illinois, he calls up the Harvard Economics Department, or has an aide call up the Harvard Economics Department because he wants a Harvard economist to advise his campaign. And whoever the aide talks to says, well, we're not really in the habit of advising obscure state senators from the Midwest, but, you might want to try this guy at the University of Chicago, and this continues over and over. And that's Austin Goolsbee. Yeah, that's how he gets connected to Austin Goolsbee. And it just, this sort of repeats itself over and over. One of his sort of outside economic policy advisors told me, and this was again around that time, early 2008, that whenever Obama would meet with an outside expert, the staff would always tell that expert, reassure him that you are the foremost expert in this subfield in the world.
That would do it for him.
He very much wants to know that, so he was very much a brand name kind of establishmentarian guy. And so it's not surprising that once, A, he has an opportunity because he's the nominee, and B, the need for sort of establishmentarian heft becomes greater because of the financial crisis, that he immediately turns to these people. There's really no hesitation at all. So in a way, this sort of insurgency, the kind of post-establishment stance or the anti-establishment stance is a bit of an illusion. And the possibility of doing something sort of radical or even sort of counter the conventional wisdom was not nearly as great as it appeared to be at that moment. He's a
cautious guy, temperamentally.
He's a cautious guy. He's a guy who likes establishment approval. I mean, I talk. I'm not sure how much I get into it in the book, but if you sort of look at the kind of personalities of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama together, obviously vast number of differences, but in a way they. It's easy to conclude from what the popular narrative about them is Bill Clinton has enormous abilities and enormous appetites and enormous insecurities. And Barack Obama, also very gifted, but restrained in his appetites, and his insecurities are almost non-existent. And in fact, both men, I think, have large insecurities. They're just different. And Clinton's was sort of social. He wanted to constantly be surrounded by people. He wanted people. He wanted to be loved. Yeah. Obama actually wants sort of intellectual approval, and you see this a lot. During the campaign and into the administration, advisors would tell me that he would propose an idea, and a couple weeks later, a couple of days later, it would turn out that the idea was correct. And so he had a common refrain. He'd say, whose idea was that? And he'd want the staff to sort of applaud.
Something I've always wondered about Obama is, do you think he has close friends with whom he, lets his hair down? Not people who've been we know he's got people like Asranzon who have been his colleagues and hitched onto the train early. But, in a sort of a Lyndon Johnson way or a Tip O'Neill way, is he a guy who's relaxed enough in his own skin, in a George Bush way, frankly, to have friends?
There is some of that. There is Valerie Jarrett, obviously, who sort of plays that first friend role in the White House. There are a couple of...
dog?
He does now have a dog, right? Which was the advice of, was it Lyndon Johnson who recommended that? He has the dog. There are a couple of friends from the South Side of Chicago. Eric Whitaker, who's a doctor. They often vacation together. So there are those people, but he doesn't have a vast network of intimates. That is certainly the case.
No, I ask you, when did you decide to write this book? Because this is a book about Obama and economics, and you could have written a book about, or someone could have, about whose field it was, Obama and global warming, and they would have ended up with a very thin book.
Right.
So at what point did you decide, wow, there's going to be enough to say, because, unlike Bill Clinton, who ran on It's the Economy, Stupid, Barack Obama ran on post-racial America, post-partisan America, post all those things we wanted to get away from, but not of the economy really,
right?
And until as 08 develops. But when did you have the idea? Wow, there are going to be 4 years worth of economic pain here to talk about.
I can actually pinpoint it with some precision. I was in a motel room in Alaska. Wasilla, Alaska, actually.
Now, what did what you?
I was just I threw a dart at a map, and that's where I ended up. And this was in September-ish of 2008, and I was actually had a contract to write a book about AIG, which, had I completed, would have been a very good book to have out on the market. But I had not completed it by that point, and as AIG was sort of immolating, it became very clear that that book project was being overtaken by events. And the reason that it was being overtaken by events was that the financial system and possibly the real economy after it were falling apart. And so as I sort of surveyed the landscape for projects to succeed the incomplete AIG project, this felt like a pretty natural one. And I was obviously in Wasilla covering the campaign and writing about Sarah Palin. And by that point, having covered the campaign for a year and a half, I was sort of burnt out on politics and had some background in economics, and just felt like this was going to be the narrative of the next few years. Whether or not Obama would have chosen it for himself,
so
it chose him.
You thought it would be the narrative for the next few years, and a lot of authors and someone wrote crisis books, but from this book, it sounds like Obama didn't think it would be the narrative or didn't want it. There were things that he wanted to do, healthcare, obviously. I mean, and it seems to be one of the leitmotifs of the book is he was a little bit unwilling or just reluctant to grasp the idea, this is really all that it's about this time, and use the phrase at one point that he's like someone who's in a hole, and he's trying to reach as high as he could have been as if he weren't in the hole. Maybe that would be healthcare or something. Was this a big mistake of his administration to focus too broadly? I mean, healthcare, forget that it may be overturned, but did he not focus enough on?
Yeah, it's a great question. That the whole metaphor actually comes from a senator who goes to see him in July of 2008, a Democratic senator who'd been pretty supportive of him from the beginning, and is basically pleading with him, to just let this go and just focus on jobs and focus on the economy. Now, we can debate what turning your attention entirely to jobs and the economy would actually mean as a practical matter, but at the very least, as a sort of the visual was a little incongruous, I think, for a lot of voters. So absolutely, I think there was a certain there was an acceptance that the presidency would now have to be very much about this, but it was very much a grudging acceptance. And it was, there was a sense that while he was going to take this very seriously and devote a lot of mental energy to it, it was not going to be the be-all and end-all of his presidency. In fact, I have describe a conversation that that Tim Geithner has with Obama during the transition. It's a phone call, and a couple other senior advisors are on the call, and Geithner tells him, your legacy is going to be averting a Great Depression, and Obama says that's not enough for me. And Geithner sort of thinks maybe he's heard him incorrectly and says no, really.
Would have been enough for Hoover.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. He says, without that, nothing else is really possible. So it's best not to get ahead of ourselves. And he says, yeah, I heard you, but it's really not enough for me. So this, and that was sort of late November of 2008. So from the very beginning, there is a sort of grudging, there's an acceptance, but very much a grudging acceptance. I think part of it had to do with the fact that it was really a sense that his predecessor had sort of stuck him with this problem on the way out the door in both large and small ways. I mean, if you
could
take
just leave it for the next Republican president.
Yeah, well, I don't think he'd leave it, but he certainly wasn't happy. It was sort of the final insult to an 8-year injury. Everything from the auto bailout, which they really did feel like, and they were right, that the administration had the Bush administration had just totally kicked the can down the road by sending it.
They did begin it.
They began, but
very
unspecified.
But particularly in Hank Paulson's defense, I would say that for him to do that, it was so contrary to his ideology. I mean, to presumably most people is to bail out private enterprise, but these weren't companies that were the victim. They were the victim of the recession, but they weren't. They weren't in the mortgage business or anything,
right.
And they were just, they were behind. They had their hands out like everyone else, and it killed Paulson to do this, but they did do it.
No, I think you make a good point. I mean, Paulson, and obviously you've written quite a bit about Ben Bernanke recently. There was sort of a lot of imagined and real constraints on fairly aggressive action that could have easily defeated other policymakers. Bernanke certainly, Paulson I think as well. And to their everlasting credit, they did not allow themselves to be shackled by those constraints. So I think you're right. I think actually Obama did respect Paulson in a way, and Bernanke. Certainly Bernanke came to admire. Well,
he keeps Bernanke on. He keeps Geithner on. I mean, obviously can't keep Paulson, who's a Republican. That's
right.
not. But in a sense, one of your criticisms is that he does as much as he can to have a continuity of administrations. I mean, keeping Geithner and then a year later Bernanke. That's a lot of continuity, for better or worse, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Geithner, who's very savvy about these things, tells him in another one of these early conversations, I want to stay, and I think it would be wise of you to keep me, but you have to understand that if you do, you're signing on to everything that came before.
Yeah, it was a tremendous comment. It was very insightful. Geithner says, if you get me now, you
get everything.
I'm not going to change my mind
Right.
about the policies that, the Bear Stearns bailout in effect. And so I did a little research before just this afternoon, and Obama right now, there are fewer jobs in the United States than there were in January 2009. And he has a chance, depending on how many jobs are added in the next however many months, he could get into the plus category. But if you start the clock in November when he ran for election, there's no way. He will be the first president to have a negative job count, actually since Hoover. And that's a long time. You just said that, supposing he'd identified jobs as his agenda, his real only focus, what would that have translated? But I think the book has an answer to that. And I mean, there's the pivotal policy point of the book, I think, is the stimulus. And the first thing, it maybe take some of us through, what was it, 870 billion? So you see that number in the newspaper one day, and you figure, I don't know what you figure. There's some way they got that number. It's a square root of something, or But actually, it's this fascinating story that you tell about how they got to that number and who got there, and the fact that Obama didn't know what the range was. Walk us through some of that.
Yeah. So Christy Romer, a lot of this happens between Christy Romer, who's the incoming White House chief economist, who's kind of the head of economic research for the White House, and Larry Summers, who's the advisor, who has to sort of bridge the economic and the principal. And so Christy Romer is doing a series of forecasts for projecting the size of the hole in the economy, basically. And she does a series of these projections leading up until about mid-December. And in mid-December, they're going to have a big meeting where they decide a number of economic policy matters, but certainly the size of the stimulus that they want to propose. And so the meeting is going to happen on a Tuesday. On a Friday, she does her final projection. And the projection is that basically to get unemployment back to what economists consider healthy, full employment, by 2011 is going to take $1.7 to $1.8 trillion. And so she gives that number to Larry Summers, and Larry Summers...
So just an extra amount of spending with no taxes behind it, borrowing, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
Well, it would be, yeah, that's right. I mean, the actual composition could be tax cuts or spending, but yes, it would be all on the government credit card.
Right.
And so she sends Larry Summers that memo. Summers says that's crazy. Go back to the drawing board. She comes back with what she thinks is sort of a compromise figure, which would not sort of solve the unemployment problem, but would make a decent amount of progress in 2 years. And that number is 1.2 trillion. She gives Larry Summers that number on a Sunday afternoon sometime. Larry Summers sort of at first suggests that number may go to the president, and then says, no, we can't send that number either. That's also a ridiculously high number.
Is he making a political decision? Is he making an economic decision? He's the economic guru. Right?
That's right. So this is sort of one of the key tensions in the book. Larry Summers is actually sympathetic to her math.
No one is sympathetic to Larry Summers.
Right. That's right.
I happen to like Larry.
So he actually believes that she's basically right. I mean, he could quibble at the margins, but she's basically right. And certainly 1.2 trillion he thinks is a perfectly reasonable economic number. But he thinks two things. One, that if the Obama administration proposes something over $1 trillion, Congress will reject it out of hand. And two, if he, Larry Summers, even proposes this in a meeting with Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod, the political people are going to laugh him out of the room. And so he says to Romer, 1.2 trillion is non-planetary, by which he means preposterous, utterly ridiculous. No one, people will think we're crazy if we propose this internally, never mind externally. And Summers, having had experience in government, and Romer being essentially a novice, Summers wins that debate. And they come and essentially, in the memo that they actually present to Barack Obama, they argue essentially that $800 billion is what you need to do. Did
Barack Obama ever hear the figure 1.8 trillion or 1.2 trillion?
He never hears those figures. The closest they get is in the meeting, Romer does say, if you really want to solve the problem, you need something over $1 trillion. And the memo that they actually end up sending him has something similar to that, but it's sort of so loaded down with caveats, and it's sort of in small type and at the margins.
It's as if General Marshall had told Franklin Roosevelt, we can land a few troops in Africa, we can try going up the boot of Italy, maybe someday we'll win the war in Japan. But,
right.
But he never mentions D-Day. He never mentions Normandy. That's
exactly, yeah. Or he may say, you may think of the coast of France, in a footnote, but there are all sorts of practical problems, and it's not even really worth considering, which was the equivalent of what was in the memo. Yeah.
And so one of the major criticisms of the book, it seems to me, is that this was too much a Geithner and maybe a Rahm Emanuel, but Geithner opposing a larger stimulus for economic reasons, and people like Rahm Emanuel for political reasons, not borrowing and spending more then, and also not going a repeat round of stimulus. Is that right? In 2011.
That's right. Yeah. So you had the sort of original sin, which is this too small stimulus. And as you say, part of that is because some people in the administration genuinely are skeptical of a very large stimulus, and others are just skeptical that it's politically feasible. And, the second problem really is that if you so fine, let's say that really was a real constraint, this political constraint. But if you think that you're gonna, you're basically gonna be $1 trillion short, it probably behooves you to think in the future about what circumstances will be most hospitable to doing more later, and to think about that from the get-go. And so I think, everyone can quibble about whether there was really a chance to pass a bigger stimulus or not. But I think few people can quibble with the fact that, people in the White House understood that this was too small, and that even under the best of circumstances, you were going to need more. And those people should have been screaming about the fact that you were going to need a strategy for setting that up. And that strategy was completely lacking. In fact, I'd argue that the circumstances under which they argued for the passage of this stimulus actually cut in the opposite direction. It sort of foreclosed the possibility of coming back, because they essentially argued that this was close to ideal, and that then sets up this terrible political dynamic in which the stimulus. Well, the argument is, for Republicans, you said this was going to work. You said this was going to keep unemployment under 8.5%, which was their projection. In fact, unemployment is now 10%. How could you think of even contemplating more when this actually took us in the wrong direction? I mean, it's a terribly cynical argument, but that's an argument that they essentially handed their Republican opponents, rather than, look, this is a down payment. It's far, far from the ideal, but we've got to do something as a stopgap. Then we'll talk about what we do, with the next step in the months down the road. So the sort of selling and framing of this was as big an error as the actual deficiency in the size.
Now, if we were having this discussion, about 6 or 7 subway stops south, calling that an error would be met with, with a lot of raised eyebrows. Are we certain that the stimulus was too small? The unemployment rate has come down from 10 plus to 8 plus. Borrowing $1.8 trillion, that'd be $6,000 more for every American. That'd be $25,000 more for every family of 4. Social Security's going broke faster than we even realize. We have all these problems, and there's a lot of scholarship that you just can't. Yes, we'd like to be lower than 8% unemployment now, but you never recover from this kind of cataclysm that quickly. People who had too much debt have to pay it off. When they're paying it off, they're not spending so much. And if we're just, there's also just sort of the Old Testament theory, which is, we violated our true economy by having people who couldn't afford things buy them with mortgage loans and so on. Do we want to just sort of substitute and say, well, you can't get money from the mortgage bank anymore, but now we'll have this false economy based on government borrowing? What may be slow and steady, although the returns aren't dramatic, ain't so bad.
Very good question. One of the deepest questions I think you could ask about this. Two responses. One sort of superficial and one maybe a little deeper. The first is, if you look at and I ended up spending a lot of time talking to the administration economists about this. Not surprisingly, they were sort of groping with these things too. A lot of the sort of counterfactual hinges on a concept that I touch on in the book called escape velocity. And the idea is, if you can sort of get the dynamics moving in the right direction, then the economy can kind of take off, and you get into sort of a virtuous self-reinforcing cycle. So, people spend more. That means companies have more revenues. They hire more people. Unemployment drops. People have more money to spend. They spend more, and so forth. The one good story that the Obama administration economists kept telling themselves about to sort of rationalize the insufficiency of the stimulus was, we know that this is in principle too small, but it may be enough to get us to this escape velocity point, at which point the economy will sort of take over on its own. And when they game this out, what they saw was that the beginning of that story actually was true. If you look at the fourth quarter of 2009 and the first quarter of 2010, you start to see signs that the economy is accelerating and it's reaching this escape velocity, and then it just sort of peters out by the end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter of 2010. And what's interesting about the data is it all is very consistent with what they project about sort of getting to escape velocity and this upturn in the beginning of this virtuous cycle. The problem is, right at the moment where you would expect the escape to happen, it kind of goes like this. And so the kind of natural deduction to draw from that, which a lot of them did, was, a lot of the dynamic they predicted correctly. They predicted when the economy would stop contracting and start growing. They predicted the acceleration in the end of 2009, the beginning of 2010. They just didn't quite have enough oomph to get over the hump. And, it actually, when they show you the charts, it is a very compelling story. Yes. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and I'm hardly the best person to make this argument, but the problem with this sort of Old Testament theory of economic recovery is this sort of paradox of thrift argument, which is, if everyone starts saving simultaneously, it actually makes us all poor at the same time, and we saw this during the Depression, for example, and so the sort of textbook prescription, which has a lot to recommend to it, is when everyone in the private sector is saving, interest rates are incredibly low. It's time for the government to borrow, and it can do so incredibly cheaply. And so that the real risk to the economy is, as someone like Ben Bernanke has written, is this sort of massive contraction in credit, and you're going to get a massive contraction in borrowing and credit if the government does not offset what the private sector is doing. And so I think as sort of appealing, as kind of intuitively appealing as the sort of Old Testament story is, I think it actually just reinforces the problem rather than solves the problem.
I mean, maybe one of the answers, you repeatedly in the book talk about Obama being, I don't remember the phrase, but a deficit cutter or a budget cutter at heart. And I kept my eyebrows raised because, after all, he's presided over the biggest deficit increase in peacetime history. But do you think this is ultimately what happened, that he more than either his allies or his foes suspect, doesn't want to go down as the guy who turned America into Greece or something? That he is a more cautious.
Oh, no question. Yeah, I think this was a constant tension. I quote one of the economic aides in the book saying that one thing that was very curious that kept happening was that Peter Orszag, who was the kind of chief deficit hawk within the administration, he would
you seem to like.
Yeah, I do like him quite a bit. Yeah, absolutely. Even though I happen to disagree with him, and he and I have had very heated debates about this, but I do like him quite a bit. Yes. Peter Orszag would go into these meetings with Obama and his top political aides and his top economic aides, and he would propose an idea, whether it was freeze on discretionary spending or freezing government salaries or whatever it was, and basically everyone in the room would hate it. Stupid, gimmicky, not going to have real impact. Only possibility is that it hurts us rather than helps. And somehow he would still carry the day. Everyone hated it, political people, economic people, and yet the administration would do what Peter Orszag was proposing. The only explanation for that is that Barack Obama himself was intrigued by these ideas, and I think that is the right explanation. I describe in the book one meeting that Orszag actually, he doesn't convene it, but he sort of initiates, and the meeting is in November of 2009. It has to do with a plan for allowing not just the upper income Bush tax cuts to expire that everyone in the Democratic Party has agreed to allow to expire, but basically all the tax cuts. And if you recall, Obama campaigned, one of his most memorable campaign promises in 2008 was, "I will not raise taxes on the middle class."
Is that like a terrible mistake? Was that his George W.H. Bush moment?
I do think it was a mistake, but the fact is there was more than just that promise hemming him in. I mean, had he not made that promise and then tried to, he would have faced almost the same amount of political pressure. I think there was an added, obviously you can imagine the campaign ads, right, with the promise, and then, had he broken the promise, the reality. But
I'm saying, was the promise wrong?
I think it was wrong to make that promise. But had he never made that promise, it would have still been, and decided that he wanted to reverse it would have still been difficult to do that. So I think the promise was a mistake, but it wasn't the only thing standing between him and
push that for a sec,
yeah.
because I wondered about this in 2010, when you may remember the original Bush tax cuts were scheduled to expire then. And had he just said, look, they were a mistake, they've gotten us in this terrible soup we're in, they gave a big benefit to the rich, they gave a little benefit to lots of other people.
Right.
And this is all of our problem.
Right.
And so we're going to take them back, and that's going to cost the rich the most. It's going to cost other people some, too. Instead of drawing what the Republicans say is this class dividing line, and just said it was a bad idea and we're giving them all back. Instead of, you and you who make more than $1 million give it back. Is that not class warfare, or is it not at least divisive, or is it at least not post-partisan?
No, I think that was the right move, and that was where I was headed with this November meeting. He was very tempted to do that. Orszag had essentially proposed doing that because the only real way to make a dent in the kind of 10-year deficit numbers. Obama is very intrigued. What ends up happening at the end of that meeting is it's a meeting with the political people and the economic people. Political people go nuts because they see him, the danger of reversing this promise, and it kind of never gets revived. But Orszag was very much in favor of it. From what I can deduce from meetings like that, Obama himself was actually interested in doing that. The political people were very resistant to doing that, and it just sort of there's a certain amount of inertia when if you have something hard and complicated and the president isn't pursuing it aggressively, that means it's dead because you need some initiative behind it. But I think you're right. I think it's clean, it's understandable. It actually meaningfully changes the deficit picture over time. You can argue that you've done something.
Is this, I think we all, or those who were excited about Obama, I should say, had a set of expectations, and when you use that, when he was elected, and when you use that phrase, the political people said no, my sort of heart sank. And is that sort of what happened, between the Obama who raised all these expectations and the one who was either a fumbler, to use the subtitle of your book, or at least something below expectations? Is he just a more political, like most of them, person than many people hope?
I think he is more political. He's a president, though. The president is a fundamental political position. So I don't think you can begrudge him too much for that. I think the bigger problem was a certain passivity. There was just a willingness to accept constraints, and obviously, you've got to be realistic. You can't go fighting the Alamo at every time out. But there was just a sort of passivity, particularly when it came to the economy. He has this conversation that I described with Christina Romer, who already by kind of April of 2009 is saying the stimulus was too small. We've got to do more. They have a conversation in front of other advisors in kind of the late summer of 2009, and she starts to bang this drum again. And he says, "Look, the American people don't think this first stimulus worked, so I can't do another one. Drop it." And on some level he was right. The public opinion numbers weren't great, but on another level, you're the president. You have a bully pulpit. As they later discovered with the whole payroll tax cut episode, there are ways of stimulating the economy that are politically popular, or at least difficult for Republicans to oppose. So there was certain passivity, a certain lack of creativity. I blame Obama mostly for that, but I also blame the team because I think, the thing that happens when you've served in an administration at the highest levels before, as was true of Geithner and Summers, I think you think you know more about the way the world works than you actually do. You know a lot, and that's important, but you think you know more. And so these guys just had certain sort of reflexes, kind of political reflexes that had been drilled into them. And so they could be so dismissive and so quick to dismiss ideas.
It's interesting when you talk about, look, he's a political person, he has a political position, he's got to deal with realities, and yet you keep documenting these situations where they're just so woeful politically. They're where they get, maneuvered into a no-win position with the debt ceiling and on taxes. The year before, they almost seem to have or you document these cases where Obama goes to the Republicans and says, I'll meet you halfway, and he gets his arm cut off from here.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Does he bear any responsibility for the death of bipartisanship, or is it just that there's this Tea Party now that will chop off the heads of any Republicans who negotiate with Democrats, and that's it?
Yeah, I blame Barack Obama for a lot of things, but not the death of bipartisanship. I think he went to possibly pathological extremes, trying to make bipartisan efforts, and was always basically kicked in the teeth for it. There's a moment to me that was really revealing, and it's in that 2010 lame duck period where they're negotiating the Bush tax cuts, right. And it's this rare case. Often in the past 3 years, you've had divisions within the economic team or divisions between the political team and the economic team. But here was this one moment in late 2010. The economic team is united. Economic team agrees with the political team, and what they agree on is that they should go out and really just using the kind of megaphone of the White House and really soften up the Republicans before they enter in this negotiation over the Bush tax cuts. Really just, if they want to kind of fall on the sword of tax cuts for the wealthy, make it hurt, And Obama, and so they're very excited about this. They're all united.
They started to, right?
Well, they had started to, and Obama says, you know what, let's not play those games. If we're going to do a deal, let's go in a room and talk seriously to them and not do these sort of tawdry political games. And, it's I think it's obviously who he is. It's his reflex. But, there was just a general failure to understand that politics and policy are just fundamentally fused together. You need leverage, and the way you get leverage in negotiation is through politics.
And which Obama do you think we're going to see in the campaign? Do you think he'll be Mr. Nice Guy with Mitt Romney? Behind him? It's
a great question. I actually just wrote a piece about this for the New Republic. They have become they've gotten very tough. It started basically with the breakdown of the debt ceiling negotiate or the deficit negotiations in August of 2011. And the first thing, actually part of it comes from Obama, who I think by this point is just frustrated that his repeated efforts at bipartisanship have been thwarted. And Obama says to his aides, "Look, we're gonna propose a stimulus package, but this time I don't want you to do it as a sort of prepackaged compromise. Just tell me what you think is right." And so from that moment on, you see this increasing stridency, you see increasing partisanship through, December he gives this speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, where he sort of talks in general terms about the GOP worldview and kind of how it's basically to sort of, withdraw government and just have government retreat and let people sort of fend for themselves through the State of the Union. And then a couple weeks ago, he gives this incredibly tough speech before a convention of newspaper editors in Washington, where he basically goes through the Paul Ryan budget and does some simple math and basically says explains in kind of gory detail what it's going to do to student loans, what it's going to do to Medicare, what it's going to do to Medicaid, what it's going to do to environmental regulations. And it is incredibly partisan and tough. And one can only conclude from this that they've sort of decided that this is this is just it's what you have to do to win this thing.
And yet at the regulatory agencies that Obama still controls, where they're writing the rules to implement Dodd-Frank, the financial reforms, really one rule after another is going the bank's way, and the whole intentions and point of Dodd-Frank are being eviscerated, and as far as I can tell, the agencies are being left to twist in the wind by the administration.
It's financial reform. It's breathtaking. I agree with you. One of the things that, and this just goes back to sort of what Obama felt in his gut. He never really felt financial reform in his gut. I think, I was talked to a lot of people involved in these conversations, and the posture, and at certain points it was said explicitly, just get me something that I can call financial reform, and having gotten something that they could call financial reform.
Is that what he did on healthcare?
Healthcare, believe it or not, there was a passion there, and there was a real,
Was there a willingness to get something first and then worry about what the something was? Or is that what we're reaping now? That mentality, get me something. Well, he has something.
It was, though, the details, relative to financial reform were just held a lot more closely. On healthcare reform, the president himself made detail level decisions about, whether we tax health benefits and how far up the income ladder we go. Nothing analogous existed on financial reform. In fact, it's funny. I would talk to them during the financial reform debate, and at various points, the White House communications shop would put out these kind of blog items and releases on financial reform, and some of them were actually very good and very smart. And I was very impressed. So I would just tell people that I knew at the Treasury Department, I was very impressed that, Dan Pfeiffer, the communications director, had put out this very learned and compelling blog item about derivatives reform. And the person at Treasury was like, they don't write that stuff. We send them all of that stuff. They don't know anything about derivatives, believe me.
I want to open this up to questions in a sec, but you just said that Obama didn't get financial reform, which isn't, how many people do? But does he get the economy? He's someone who, community organizer, Harvard professor, state legislator, but do you think he's someone who understands, after all, you can spend all this money, but it's people out there who own businesses, some of them large, but some of them small, have to decide they want to hire somebody, they have to feel confident, they have to see the cash register ringing. Is that something that he feels in his bones, that this is in the way that, and are there people in his administration, are there Hank Paulson types who feel that in their bones, that this is something that's only going to happen, not at the governmental level, it's going to have to happen at the private sector level? Does he get that?
I don't. Well, there are two questions, right? One is mechanics. Does he sort of have a deep and subtle understanding of the all of the forces out there in the economy that account for growth? On that, I would say yes-ish. I think he's a quick study. He began to appreciate kind of what it would take. He would have these periodic tutorials with Larry Summers, who would, they instituted something called the Economic Daily Briefing. And it's funny because Rahm Emanuel was the father of this idea, because he thought it was necessary politically to show the country that the president is taking the economy as seriously as he takes national security. Of course, he gets a daily security briefing. And after 6 months, they hated this, right? Because they realized it was just an hour on the president's day, which is incredibly valuable. And they wanted to take it back, but having implemented it, you couldn't really get rid of it. And so Summers would sort of use these as opportunities to just basically tutor Barack Obama on the economy. And, on everything from, why productivity tends to rise in a recession and, the dangers of long-term unemployment. And so I think, if you talk, I think if you talk to the people who would be in the room for these tutorials, the consensus would be he's quick, he gets these things. At one point, I think Christy Romer told me she was going to present, she wanted to present some econometric data, to the president. And one of the sort of quasi-political economic aides who sort of straddles the two worlds said, you can't present a multiple regression analysis to the president, And so he said no. And then Romer thought, well, why don't I just try, And she did, and she said he got, he really grasped it. So I think it was not his first love, but he was a quick study, and he's got a facile mind, and he was able to get up to speed on it. Where he fell short was just feeling in his gut that people care about their livelihoods above everything else. He never made that sort of emotional leap, and I think. Something that Larry Summers told me, I think sort of epitomized it. Summers had told me this, trying to be very complimentary to the president, but I think in a way it's sort of damning. And he said something like,
Larry,
yeah, exactly. Right. Counterintuitively for him. He said something like, I always admired the president for realizing that in 50 years, people would remember that they got health care, but they wouldn't remember, how long it took to get out of the recession. And I think think that is how Obama thought of it. But as Keynes said, in 50 years we may all be dead. So I think the president, and I think to this day he still feels that way. He believes that an extra year at the margins is a year, but this is sort of world historical stuff that he's working on: climate change, healthcare, and if something has to suffer, it's the former and not the latter. And I think just to do one more foray into psychoanalysis before we turn over to questions, I think this kind of goes back to the sort of different insecurities of a Barack Obama versus a Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had this need for sort of social affirmation that kind of extended to the country writ large. He wanted to be popular in this moment, in the next moment, and every moment of his presidency. Obama wants sort of intellectual approval. He wants the approval of elites. And that means, he's perfectly happy to be unpopular in a given moment if he will sort of ultimately be vindicated. And I think that sort of accounts for the two trajectories of their respective presidencies in a lot of ways.
Noam, I think your account of Obama's daily sessions with the economy and grasping some of the econometrics also points out how financialized the country's been, the government has become, and it's always sort of it's the economy, stupid now. To just recall another insecure president, Richard Nixon, when he was in the middle of a currency crisis, his Secretary of the Treasury, John Connolly, began to go over some of the fine points of the various European currencies with him. And Nixon, of course, said, "I don't give a fuck about the lira." That was his level of detail. So why don't we open it up to questions?
Sure. You spoke a lot about, there was debate about the number of the stimulus, but can you talk about, there was debate about the mix of the stimulus and where the money would go, and whether that was,
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. There was very much a debate about the composition of the stimulus. And, Peter Orszag sort of gets tarred, a little bit by me, but mostly by a lot of his colleagues as being sort of resistant to larger stimulus. But I think a big part of his concern was that as a practical matter, there were only so many ways to get money out the door. And in response to that, there are two responses to that. One is tax cuts. You can always cut taxes. And two is you can always just give money to states because they're laying off teachers and firefighters. And so aid to states seemed like an incredibly efficient and high bang for your buck proposition. And so they thought that basically, the ideal would be, a lot of these sort of, shovel-ready projects, and then just like a ton of money to states, $300, $400 billion if they could get it. The problem was politically, that was like, this is the one place where I'm pretty sympathetic to them politically. I mean, if you Republicans love to sort of drone on about moral hazard and just rewarding irresponsible spending by states, and so that number just, they didn't propose anywhere near the amount they considered ideal, and then what they did propose got whittled down fairly dramatically. And it's one of these cases where the textbook would tell you, every economist, not every, it would be a huge consensus among economists that this would be a very efficient way to spend money, and it was just unattainable. So, they debated this stuff, but at a certain point, I think the political constraint, actually, I mean, it may be counterintuitive. The political constraint, I think, bound them more on the composition even than the size. I think there were ways, if you were willing to just cut taxes, that you could have gotten a much bigger package. But there was just not a lot of ways to get more aid to states, which was very frustrating.
Yeah.
On Reinhardt and Rogoff, their work, I think it was around in 2008. The book came out in 2009. How much of an impact did that have on the administration on the financial crisis, and how long it takes to get out of that, no matter what you do?
It's a great question. There is some revisionism here. My sense is at the time, Summers was sort of dimly aware of the Reinhardt and Rogoff work. There's this guy, Richard Koo, who's a Japanese, economist, but a private sector economist, who wrote a book called The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics that has a sort of similar thesis about recessions that come in the aftermath of financial crises. I think Summers knew Kuh a little bit and knew Reinhardt and Rogoff. I don't think that was at the front of their thinking, really. And basically no one else was really thinking it. Now, if you fast forward 3 years, Summers would tell you that he was like intimately aware of this work. It was like vital in his thinking about the crisis. But, you know, I actually talked to others about this, and even people who are sort of generally aligned with Summers on their historical memory don't remember this figuring very prominently into the discussion. So it's not really till kind of the second half of 2009 and into 2010 where I think that starts to come more to the forefront of their thinking. And it, you know, not coincidentally, I think Summers really starts to be much more adamant about getting more stimulus right around that time, you know. So I think Summers is sort of early to that party, not quite as early as he would suggest in retrospect, but he was definitely aware of the work, and it sort of moved to the center of his thinking over time.
So I think, to be fair to the administration on that, you know, Reinhardt and Rogoff say it's going to take a while, but how would that really affect them? Would they say, well, you know, it takes a long time, so we're not going to do anything. It took them 8 years in the Depression, so
right.
So you can't.
It's a fatalist argument on some level.
And this time is different every time is always a little bit different in some respects. You know, this time it was housing, right. So how would they deal with that? The one
practical area, and Orszag actually sort of has talked about this a bit lately, is you know, the big thing that weighs down the economy after a financial crisis is the debt overhang, right? So people are not going to go out and borrow money, and probably not even going to spend much money if they have this huge amount of debt that's weighing them down. Obviously, this time a big portion of that debt was mortgage debt, and so it is in some ways an argument for a very bold, aggressive housing plan. And that was something I talk about in the book where, you know, again, Summers was sort of, to the extent that there was an internal advocate of a big, aggressive housing response, Summers was that advocate. But even he sort of didn't entirely have his heart in it. So sort of every couple of months they would reconvene and kind of, you know, read the op-eds that, you know, economists had written and get some of them on the phone and then decide it was totally unworkable and forget it until we reconvene in 3 more months.
On balance, the Obama administration's record on arresting foreclosures doesn't look that much different than the Bush administration, would you say? I mean, is that they just didn't find the lever to do it, weren't convinced it was the thing to do, too politically tough, some of all?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And they could just never... You know, there was always this question of who was going to pay for it. You know, does the government pay for it? Do the banks pay for it with write-downs? And there are moral hazard problems.
No one starts paying their mortgage.
That's right. And politically, it's terrible, right? Because if your mortgage is underwater, but you're still paying your mortgage, and the guy down the street is underwater, but he's not paying his mortgage, then he gets a bailout and you don't. I mean, this is, you know, it was, in a narrow way, the origin of the Tea Party, right? You have this guy, Rick Santelli, get up and scream about this on CNBC. So politically, I think they were always scared off by this. And you're right. I mean, the record is not appreciably better than the predecessor.
Yeah.
Can you give a little insight into what was OMB's role in all this? You looked at economic camps, the political camps, and what's your prognosis now that Jacob Lew is, you know, inside the White House? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, OMB, you know, Orszag was very effective. As I said, you know, oftentimes he'd go in these meetings and everyone would be against it and Orszag would win. So OMB was very influential under Orszag. In fact, you know, in the first year of the Obama administration, there was talk that Orszag could be chief of staff, which is not crazy given that Lew has made that leap. So they were very influential. And in fact, influential in a negative way, I would argue, because what ends up happening is by the summer of 2009, Orszag is already very exercised about the deficit, and you end up getting this huge kind of internal split about whether the priority should be deficit reduction or should be stimulus. It's a little more complicated than that because Orszag was in principle open to more stimulus. He just thought it should be paired with this ambitious deficit reduction package, but he was definitely very exercised about this, really banging the drums internally. At one point in August of 2009, he convenes this meeting or a series of meetings basically arguing that they should release a new budget in the middle of the year, basically. And the budget's released every February, and it's a huge undertaking. I mean, it just takes a ton of effort. Hundreds of people work on it. And Orszag was saying, we should basically stop what we're doing on this healthcare thing and put out a new budget that really shows that we're going to take the deficit seriously. So Orszag ends up being, he's very influential. I argue he's sort of a paralyzing force because he doesn't actually get his way on something like that, but he sort of thwarts action on any other dimension as well. Jack Lew, I think, the Lew logic of Lew to me is you're going to have an unbelievably important 2 months immediately after Election Day if Barack Obama wins, or it's important whether he wins or loses, but if he wins, he's got to deal with it, which is figuring out what to do with the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, expiration of the payroll tax cut, these automatic deficit cuts that go into effect, the tax Mageddon, as dorks in Washington refer to it, myself included. And Jack Lew is just the guy that Obama trusts more than anyone else in the world on these questions. He was at Obama's side every step of the way in the negotiations with Republicans in 2011. Obama completely trusts him, completely defers to him on all these questions. And I think the logic of making him chief of staff is that 2 month period. If he does nothing but, cut a good deal in those 2 months and the rest of his term as chief of staff is totally undistinguished, he will have done his job.
Yeah, in the back there.
Yeah, and since you actually start moving forward a little bit, if Obama wins another term and he doesn't take both the Senate and the House, how do you see his administration being able to work with Republicans who don't seem to want to work with anyone?
Yeah, I'm really torn. I think Obama could go. I think one of two things is going to happen. Either Obama will sort of stick with his tough line. He'll say, the upper income tax cuts, for example, have to expire, and Republicans will say, no way, and Obama will say, okay, fine, well, they're all going to expire then, because that's what, that's the law. So that would be extrapolating based on the last 6 or 8 months. But extrapolating based on the last 3 years, I would say Obama is going to basically strike a deal. And obviously there's not going to be enough time in those 2 months to work out every detail of the deal, because the deal is basically going to require tax reform. We're going to have to overhaul the entire individual, personal tax system. Possibly, they might even throw corporate tax in there for good measure. So I think what would happen in that case is they would reach an agreement on principles of tax reform, and they would extend everything for, say, a year and say, we're giving ourselves this year to fill in the details of these principles that we've agreed to. And my concern with that is I don't trust him to negotiate a favorable set of principles, when he sort of goes off in a room and tries to negotiate in good faith with the other side. There's been just no indication over the past 3 years that that's been a recipe for success. So I would actually prefer that they do the former, because the beauty of
Just let it go.
Yeah, the beauty of that. Look, we're probably going to get some kind of tax reform either way. But what allowing them all to expire, the beauty of allowing them all to expire is it is the baseline that gives you leverage rather than the one that gives the other
Start
side
from a
leverage.
series of higher rates.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're negotiating to move away from what Republicans consider a lousy world, rather than extend them all for another year while you negotiate over principles, which is the world that Republicans sort of want to be in. So, and as the president, he has the power to just let them all go away.
You talk about Team Obama, that's your phrase. Would you care to speculate if he's reelected, who's going to be holding the big seats in Team Obama term 2?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Treasury Secretary is the big prize, and Tim Geithner is leaving. The talk, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the administration a couple of days ago about this. I think the internal talk, it sort of, it gives me pangs of anxiety, but Erskine Bowles is a name I've heard a lot. Obama seems to like him. He served on this deficit cutting commission. Oh, is that right? He's a Columbia B School guy. So I would retract that. So, Erskine Bowles is a name you hear a lot. Interestingly, I actually talked to Geithner. I had in one of our interviews, Geithner and I talked about this, and his view was that his successor should be a politician. Again, Geithner is often very savvy. I don't know if you've found this in your interactions with him, but he's much more self-aware than you see from his sort of public pronouncements and appearances. And his view was, we are now in a period where we are having a fundamentally political debate. It is no longer a technocratic debate. It is a debate about how big government should be, what we should fund, who should bear the burden of it. These are political questions, and you basically need a politician to help you sell your view on these questions. And Geithner, understands that he's not such a person, and that in certain ways, his inability to do that hurt the administration. And so I think his outgoing advice to Obama would be someone like pick Mark Warner, pick a senator who has some economic know-how and is used to operating in this arena. It's an open question. I can see. My view would be it would be an absolute masterstroke to pick Sheila Bair, say, who Tim Geithner basically reviles and will probably do everything in his power to block. But she is nominally a Republican, so you would get some bipartisan credibility there, and she is someone who has enormous credibility on sort of financial rectitude, I guess.
You want someone that steeped in the history of the bailout and the career, it's almost like picking Tim Geithner too.
No, I think that's right. I think there are a variety of reasons that won't happen. That's one of them. It's a little backward looking rather than forward looking. So you hear Erskine Bowles a lot. I'll say that.
It won't be Elizabeth Warren.
It will not be Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
Sort of going back to the past, then there's a certain perception that the Simpson-Bowles Commission was really kind of ignored, or nothing came out of that. And
there certainly is.
Yeah, I'm wondering why that is. I didn't realize Obama liked the one. Why did that happen?
The story that you hear from the administration folks, is Obama liked the product of Simpson-Bowles. He thought it would be the place to end up. But they felt, I think probably correctly, that if they embrace this as soon as the commission releases it into the world, that that immediately becomes the left pole in the debate rather than the ending point. And if you define the left pole as Simpson-Bowles and you have the Paul Ryan budget as the right pole, you're going to end up somewhere in between, which is going to be a pretty conservative place. So that was their anxiety, I think. I mean, that's what they say, and I think it's credible. If you're in...
overthinking? Because Simpson-Bowles, there was a Republican, there was a Democrat, it was bipartisan. This was the blending of two poles, supposedly. And if they just said, we got both sides together, and this is what they came up with, so we're willing to go with what both sides came up with.
The reason I think that argument, their concern, is valid is that you saw this play out 8 months later when you had this gang of six in the Senate work on their own sort of compromise proposal. And the administration, as soon as they released that compromise, Obama himself got out there that day, I think, at a press conference and said, this is good stuff. And Republicans immediately sort of ran. It became the Obama plan, not the sort of gang of six or the compromise plan. So I think whether or not that was the actual rationale, I think it is a legitimate rationale, and I think that is the dynamic that would have likely happened.
So why will the next 4 years be any different? I mean, if the Republicans cannot be bargained with, which is basically what you're saying, and that's basically the evidence. Why won't the next 4 years just be a replay? You know, frustrating and
Yeah, I think there's no reason to think that other than the point I made earlier about getting leverage, which and I think the way to get leverage and to ensure that you have a basis for negotiation is to allow all the tax cuts to expire, because that is a world that Republicans don't want to live in. And once
wouldn't they just say, fine, you live with it, we're going to throw that at you for the next 4 years, and you know, you better run for shelter come 2016 because you know, you guys raise taxes.
You know, my view of the Republican Party is that it appears to be an ideological institution, but is actually like an institution dedicated to the upward redistribution of wealth. And if you have like 4 years in which we sort of, you know, massively upwardly redistribute wealth from where it is today, is not a very appealing idea for Republicans. So I think they actually would want to, you know, if there is a deal in which, you know, we split the difference on that upward redistribution of wealth, I think they take that deal.
Why don't we take one last question? Yeah.
So the payroll tax, using that for stimulus is clever, but does anybody in the administration worry about it undermining Social Security support in the long term?
I think they do. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting because they did start to get some heat on the left for the payroll tax, especially when they, you know, I think everyone was happy to have it in 2011, but when they went to renew it in 2012, you did, you know, certainly labor started to moan a little bit, and so there was a sort of a small subset of liberals in the House that were very anxious about it. I think they, you know, look, I mean, they were in a position where they're just trying to get as much stimulus as they could, you know, by 2011, by late 2011, you know, but certainly the case that you know, Social Security financing is already somewhat convoluted, right? And when we pay money into a trust fund, and Social Security is supposed to be able to tap that trust fund, and a lot of conservatives say, well, we don't even believe that trust fund exists. So the moment that Social Security starts to run a deficit, it's effectively, you know, insolvent, even though it's supposed to be able to pay out benefits for another 20 years or whatever after that. So I think it is a legitimate concern. I mean, there is there are forces that basically want to use the finances of Social Security as an argument for either, you know, ending the program or privatizing a portion. And I think that they sort of started to get, you know, I think that, again, the initial imperative was just get money out the door because the recovery needs to be reinforced. But I think they're starting to, I think that is an anxiety that has crept in a bit. And it's something that I think they want to address. You know, I think they'd be unlikely to just kind of sort of reflexively renew the payroll tax cut in 2013 just because it's the path of least resistance. I think there is starting to be this anxiety about that, and you know, as part of the entire tax reform conversation, it would be hard for me to imagine that they simply say, you know, we'll just we'll just renew this again, and that'll be our kind of nod to the short-term health of the economy. So I think it was something they thought almost not at all about at the outset, but in the last round, as they got a little heat for it, I think there was some sort of low-grade conversation about that and what it could do, almost sort of more politically to Social Security than to the actual finances of the program. Yeah.
So, Noam, you going to be around to sign some books?
Yeah,
Okay.
happy to do that.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you for being here. I do want, in closing, to come back to something you said a moment ago. First of all, Dean Hubbard apologized. He'd actually wanted to come this evening, but had a conflicting engagement. I'm sure that he would have loved to have heard and would fully have endorsed your view of the Republican Party as an institution. I just want to make sure I get this right. Later, as an institution devoted to the cause of
Upward redistribution of wealth. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.